Hi, I'm DV LeBron with the Ellis Talker Show. Today, my very special guest is former WISD school board member Matt Authier. Did I say it right?
Authier, but you're close enough. I've heard it every which way.
Authier. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is because I've seen you vocal on Facebook, and I've seen you vocal about school choice and your thoughts on it, and then about our current HD10 and his decisions towards school choice. So I wanted to have you on to bring another side to it so that parents could hear, because this is about parents and kids, and I want you to get across these points that maybe they didn't hear before. So I really appreciate you coming on the show, Matt.
Absolutely. I've watched your show for many years as I get ready to gear up for local elections and learning about candidates. So I know this is a hobby for you, but you do provide a wealth of information for residents in Ellis County.
Thank you, sir. There might be people that don't know you. You were a former WISD school board member. Can you tell me more about you?
Yeah, so just briefly, and like I said, I want this to be more about public schools and our teachers, but briefly, who am I? We moved to Waxahachie. I grew up in Corsicana, went to Texas A&M University, graduated with a bachelor's degree in accounting, master's degree in finance, and also sat for and passed my CPA exam my last year at A&M. Married my wife right after graduation. She was also an Aggie at the same time. We started dating as freshmen in high school in Corsicana. Lived in Dallas for a year, realized there was too much concrete. She decided to apply in Waxahachie ISD. She's been an educator since 2010. Started as a junior high social studies teacher, went into administration as a vice principal, and then she's been the principal at Wildman STEAM Academy in Waxahachie ISD for the last 6 years. So she's got about 15 years of public ed. We've got 3 boys, Anderson, Brooks, and Campbell, 12, 10, and 8. So they're in the public school system. We have our first junior hire DV. And let me tell you, the junior high is a whole nother animal, but we have enjoyed our time in Waxahachie. I ran for and was elected to the school board in 2014, the same year that the big high school bond passed. And so I was on the school board for 3 years. And when my wife decided to pursue administration in public schools, specifically Waxahachie ISD, I decided that wasn't appropriate for me to be on the board at the same time that she was pursuing her career goals. We go to church here, First United Methodist Church, and have just fallen in love with Ellis County and Waxahachie. They have embraced our family. It can be a little bit hard for small communities to allow new blood in, especially in leadership. But serving on the school board for those 3 years gave me a great deal of respect for our public school system. And before that, I worked right out of school. I worked at Deloitte & Touche, and I audited school districts. So I audited Dallas ISD, audited Mansfield ISD, a lot of other municipalities around the Metroplex. Currently, I'll just end this, but currently I'm a mortgage loan originator at Gateway Mortgage here in Waxahachie, and I've been doing that for the last 7 years.
That's paper. That's a lot of paper.
Yeah.
I commend you for serving your community as an elected official at one point. I know that is not a choice that I would ever make. It's just, there's just too much that goes into it. And I love this county. And you're right. For outsider to come in, the first thing they were like, who's that dude with the funny hat? So it took years, and now I've been embraced, and I love this county, and I've met such great people, and I'm very grateful for that. I've seen these contentious posts online, and
I apologize, DV. That's not who I am, but
there's been some contentious posts. But you see, what I got out of it was that you have a different perspective on how to educate our children more effectively. I think maybe sometimes it gets a little passionate, but I could tell that it was from here. We talked, and you wanted to talk about the kind of the downsides. So what is the biggest downside that you see with ESAs and school choice? Or
go ahead.
Or vouchers.
We can call them what they are. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
My biggest, and I'll just preface this because I do wear my emotions on my sleeve. I'm a passionate person when it comes to public schools. It saved my life, if you will, as a young person, and the teachers and the coaches that were involved in my life. Being a school board member, you see the other side of it that a lot of people don't see, and they don't get paid. That is not a paid position like some that are elected. It is a volunteer position, and it is hours and hours. A full-time job is not even a good way to describe it. And these people are also trying to make a living while they're serving their community. And my background comes from, I served as a school board member. I was right after school board. I was 6 years on the Education Foundation for Waxahachie ISD. Substitute taught when mortgages got slow I love teaching. I've taught personal financial literacy in public schools here in Waxahachie ISD since 2017, where we go into classes at the teacher's beck and call that says, hey, we don't understand this subject, but we really want our students to grasp it. Can you bring some professionals in the classroom? So we've been doing that for the better part of 8 years. And so my contention with, and I don't want this to be about Mr. Harrison. I think I have a lot of respect for elected officials. The time that they spend away from their family is immense. The sacrifices that they make for that. And we'll talk a little bit about why I do get a little bit passionate, as you say. Social media, not the best place, but just in all transparency, I've met him at his office. I've emailed him. I've done those things that you probably should do in a little bit more peaceful manner. And he's good to talk to in person. We just vehemently disagree on public education. Okay. And specifically, you asked about ESAs or vouchers. And when these started to come up, 2017, 2019 was the real big push. 2023, we thought, hey, they're about to push this over the finish line. And what is that going to do to public education? And my kind of where this all came from is when I started school board in 2014, you could really start to see a vocal opposition. It was a minority, it was a small group, but a vocal opposition to public schools, specifically to bond campaigns. And I was on the growth committee for the one that passed the high school that is out there right now. I was on the school board for the next one. And then as soon as I got off school board, I helped to pass the bond that built Simpson Elementary, and then was the co-chair for the one that just passed the new high school, the $500 million, the largest one in Ellis County history. And it was about 2014 that we started to see language, behavior, opposition that we hadn't seen before. It was no longer okay just to be for or against something. There was this kind of slow campaign to really knock the knees out of public education. And it started with big money, West Texas. We can get into that if you want to follow that, but there's a lot of money behind. There's school board candidates. I think I ran my school board campaign. I ran one of what I think was the best ones, putting signs in the ground, knocking on doors. Nobody had really ever done that up until that point because you didn't have to. It was who you knew and your name recognition, that kind of stuff. And when we passed that bond in 2014 for the high school, we were called names. We were issued lawsuits. You couldn't do anything to be the champion for public school and what you thought was best. Our school was 50 years old. It was busting at the seams. We needed a new one. In my opinion, the most pure form of government is the local government, the one that is as close to the taxpayers as possible, which is city, schools, and county. They're accountable to those folks, not only when they're behind the dais at their respective meetings, but also in the grocery store because they see them. I think you lose that when you get on a plane or you get in a car to go to Austin or go to Washington, D.C. And so that most pure, the voters said yes. And so we built that school, right? And then after that, really with House Bill 3 in 2019, you started to see language required on bonds that almost makes it impossible to pass a bond. We had to campaign and raise a ton of money just to get the word out to try to defeat some of this. This is a tax increase language, or you're voting for a raise in taxes, that kind of stuff. And so the voucher problem to me is not so much what is it going to do for those kids. Parents have school choice, right? They've got charter, they've got public, they've got private, they can homeschool. They have the choice to do those things. My fear is, and what Mr. Harrison talks about a lot, is this idea of competition. And that's a fair component because normally in a capitalistic society, competition is good, right? However, when it's not is when one side can't play fairly, okay? And so just imagine you got a billionaire West Texas oil man, this is not a false story, by the way, who owns a private school. And he wants to pay teachers $85,000 a year to go to teach at their private school. He can afford to do it on his own dime, right? It's not no skin off his back. And now you have these vouchers that come in. By the way, 2019 or 2021, it was an $8,000 voucher was the proposal. The tuition at the billionaire in West Texas that I'm talking about, it's private school, is $8,900. There's no, that's not by happenstance. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so my fear is if that person can hire a teacher at $75,000, $85,000, by what measure is the public school able to compete? Where a starting teacher is $54,000 in a pretty aggressively salaried district, right? And so until you fully fund that component, how will you ever compete? What teacher wouldn't go to any school right now with the weight of unfunded mandates on them? They're doing their best with as little as possible. So what teacher wouldn't jump at the chance to go make $20,000 more on day one with the school district saying, I can't compete with that. That's like me as a lender, when somebody quotes a rate that's 1% below and I just can't match it. I'm saying, guys, you'd be silly not to go do that. And so that's my biggest fear. And we can talk about special education. I have huge concerns regarding that and what vouchers might do. But my biggest fear is when you talk about competition, is you're asking somebody to compete on an unfair playing field.
And that is the thing that I can understand. Like I hadn't looked at it quite like you articulated it, but there has to be something different, because we've been doing education kind of the same way for such a long time, Matt. Maybe it's good to look at different ways of doing things now, because as you learned as a board member, and I learned as a special needs dad, is that not all these kids are made the same. They're not all square in a square, they're different, every
Right.
one of them.
Right.
And so what I've seen is that there are some serious issues with that. Now, talking about the special needs kids, there was about a 7 billion, according to the meeting they had in Austin. There was some people that were talking about that, and there was somebody said, and I'm sorry I don't have the name, folks, but
Sure.
It was like $7 billion shortfall in special education, and that was the money that schools had to put extra to special education. Now,
Right.
that was a concern.
DV, that's a fair point, because my second, if fair competition is number one barrier for me. Number two is serving the kids. Like, our private schools or wherever these vouchers end up going, are they going to be required to take every child that applies and that shows the voucher, right? Or the ESA? Are they going to be able to are they going to have to deal with kids that have discipline issues like public schools do? Are they going to have to provide and support those needs of special education children, right? I was a substitute last year in a life skills class on an elementary campus. It was one of the scariest things that I thought going into it, just because I had no clue what to expect, right? And what I did, and this goes to the financial component of special ed, I was looking at it. Waxahachie ISD, of their entire budget, or of their entire enrollment, 15.8% of their student base qualifies for special education.
Yes,
students with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think the funding matches that? Absolutely. And so when I went into that life skills class, and just a shout out to Miss Lockamy, she is an angel and a saint, and I know she's still in the district, and she was amazing that day. And this is me, who I'm not particularly trained to know what to do in that classroom. My job for the entire day, DV, was to stand behind a child and make sure he didn't hit somebody next to him. It was the sweetest kid. He didn't know, it wasn't any fault of his. He didn't know what he was doing, but he was a hitter. And so you had one person, I don't know what I made that day, $120, maybe $75 as a substitute. You had one person assigned to one child. And that's what happens a lot of times in our special populations, is that you don't have the right ratio because you can't afford it. And are they qualified to be in there? I don't know. I think ours do. Our special education department's amazing in Waxahachie, but they don't have the funding to take care of the kids that show up on their door on the first day in August, and they're going to treat, require, and take care of those needs regardless of what their last name is.
And because of that funding, Matt, what happens, and I've seen this, what happens is that when you're having art and you set up an IEP, some of those things don't get met because, you know, that there's all these different reasons why.
Yeah,
but
and it's not intent, right? You've gone through that process. These teachers aren't purposefully not, they're doing the best that they can with what they have, whether that be skill set or whether that be funding. They are doing the absolute best to take care of every child that approaches them or encounters their classroom every single day. And that's my biggest challenge, and I think threat to being able to say, you go over here, but we're not going to take you if you have any sort of special need. Because, and I've talked to private school people that are on private school boards of the churches here in town, they don't want the vouchers because they don't want the government strings attached. They don't want to have to figure out if they can pray or require a kid to pray or to take a Bible class or to do any of those things. And I say all this, I'm a Sunday school teacher. Our kids go to church every Sunday. I've tried to ever since I was an adult to take my child to church. I love those values, right? But when you're talking about public and private, there's a reason that the First Amendment of the Constitution exists, right? And so you've got to think about, are they going to be able to take care of the children that might use those vouchers to go to their school, or are they just coming back and boomerang into public?
So you have these different things that are thrown out, and we talked about funding for school. And one of the things that are said is that schools are funded more than they ever been funded before, and that money has gone up. And then when you look at that compared to, and I saw these graphs and I saw these things where you look at that and you look at where the performance is, and that the gap doesn't match or doesn't, it's not good, it's not a good look.
Yeah.
When supposedly you got this much and now you're down here on these test scores and whatever, how do you talk to a parent who sees that?
Yeah. And I'll say specifically because there was a lot of graphs and stats shown out with Mr. Harrison on your show. And I've got them on my whiteboard. I've watched that episode probably 6 times, just taking different notes because I couldn't figure out where no, it's good. It was good. I appreciate it. People need to know. I'm not here to tell you one way or the other. Information is what's best, and let people decide what they want to decide.
Exactly.
And so my point on, he mentioned 23, and he said this on the floor of a House testimony in August, that 23 and 24% respectively in reading and math were not proficient, 4th and 8th graders. I think he said 8th grade. Let's say 8th grade. So I'm like, where is that? No, I'm very familiar with the TA data. I look at it every year when I was a school board member. I'm an auditor. I'm a former CPA. Numbers is what I do. And so I'm like, I've never seen 23 and 24% proficient. So I start looking at it and start researching. It's NAEP data, National Assessment Educational Performance, I think. I may have got the acronym wrong, but it's NAEP. That is a random test that maybe 40 kids in a district, maybe 400 kids in a district take. They're selected by this NAEP group. I think it's run by the NEC. And it's an arm of the Department of Education, federal. And so our teachers don't teach to that test. I don't like the fact that they have to teach to any test. But if they're going to teach to one, they're going to teach to the STAR because that's what A through F ratings are tied to, right? So they're not teaching to NAEP. And so I think the context of where 23 and 24% proficiency comes from has to be explained. If you look also at the same group that provides that data, it put Texas in the bottom 10 of school funding. And so there's where you want to look at apples to apples, right? If you want teachers to do really well on the NAEP test, then you might want to tell them to teach towards it. Instead of saying, hey, we're pulling your kid out of class, he's going to take this NAEP data or test, and it has no effect on his grades. So how well do you think he's going to try to do on it, he or she, right? So it's apples to apples, and apples to oranges is huge when it comes to that. And we'll talk about funding. You said it's the record levels of funding, right? And I talked to you a little bit about this earlier. When you look at the number that's being thrown out, whether it's DeAngelis or all these guys that Mr. Harrison shares on Twitter, 17,000 or 16,900 per student is about the number they're using. That includes $3,700 of local funds that are used to build buildings. And so that shouldn't count because those are voter approved. And I will always say that the voter approved mandates or funding should always trump whatever comes out of Austin, unfunded mandate or partially funded mandate, whatever. Okay. So if you strip that down, and this is why I think a lot of people, and even Mr. Harrison said the basic allotment, you hear that term. The basic allotment from the state has not changed since 2019. The reason why the basic allotment is important because it's apples to apples. It's what every school gets per student in the state of Texas, right? That is the number that hasn't changed. You can't say, and when you use 16,700 or whatever it is, Waxahachie's $2,700 less than that number. So why not celebrate that? Look what Waxahachie ISD is doing. I'm sure Midlothian's the same. Look what they're doing compared to the state. But that's not the narrative you get. And talking about test scores, if you take into account what COVID did for learning loss, it's incredible. These kids were essentially on a screen with their parents, and we're pretty plugged in parents. It was the hardest 2 years of our life trying to teach we had a kindergartner at the time, a second grader, and a third grader, trying to teach them those things. And that's where I gained the utmost respect for our teachers to be able to teach 22, 23 kids at a time when I was trying to do 3 during COVID, and it felt impossible at times. So think about those parents that didn't have the luxury of that or had jobs that they couldn't be at home. What do you think they were doing? They were looking at a screen, right? Watching a video, watching TV. The learning loss, you should see the stats coming out of COVID. It's 60% and it goes straight up to 77 the next year. Good job, teachers. That is what the power of our teachers can do. And so instead of throwing out a national stat of 23, 24% on a test that these kids don't even know what it is, And the teachers have never showed them an example of what that test looks like, because it doesn't matter. You have to take it. You have to be subject to the pool so that you get your Title I funds every year, right? That's the requirement. And Brian wants to be done with the Department of Education. So why use a report and a stat that Department of Education is in charge of putting on? I don't agree with that stat.
And there is the STAR testing, and there's a lot of arguments for testing, not testing, takes away what education's supposed to be because you're teaching to the test. There's all those arguments, which on some of them I happen to agree. But there has to be a metric. So that is the metric that we have. And so
for national comparison.
No, I'm talking about just in general in Texas, right?
STAR. Okay, gotcha.
We got STAR. That's the metric we have. Faulty, whatever it may be, it's the metric we have. And it does show some problems. So what do you tell a parent that sees these things and says, gee, I would love for my kid to have another option in that school? Because not all, we're not blessed. Look, Ellis County is blessed. Hollingsworth, Mr. Belding, they're doing bang up jobs. Those guys are outstanding. But there's people in Oak Cliff not so lucky.
Right.
There's
and I would
people,
say, and this is where, and this is where I'll say I'm not as much as I am against the idea of vouchers on a whole level. If you, in my business, if a person cannot afford a down payment on a house and they're below a certain income level, they can qualify for down payment assistance, right? It's based on their geographic area. It's based on their income, debt ratio, credit score, all those sorts of things, right? I would be happy to discuss the idea of doing something like that. If you can prove to whoever the body that gets assigned to govern this thing that your school district is not meeting your needs and you want to take your property tax dollars to another place, I would approve something like down payment assistance for mortgage lending, right? This idea. I don't think it's right for those that can afford it, right? We got these billionaires that are opening up private schools all over the place to push their agenda. And I'm just not for a blanket level voucher because I think, one, how do you pay for it? I still don't know the answer to that. Even the one that was proposed in 2023, I don't know how you pay for it. If it's, I think there's only 2 or 3% of students that go to public or private versus public across the state. I don't know how you pay for it. If you're talking 8, and Brian said public schools are getting 16,700, maybe it should be that much, right? Where does that money come from other than taking it away from what the public schools are getting?
They have, like, I was reading a little bit of the bills and they're very difficult, but I was looking at some of the bills and they talk about out of the general fund pulling out. And it's like this original project is supposed to be, they have checks and balances for people that are too wealthy using it. They put on that. They put a capped amount of what the money can be on there. And those are different depending on the bills I've seen. But most of them talk about taking that out of the general fund, but it being a small, like, pilot. But some of these bills were talking about it being, okay, let's see what happens when we do this kind of deal. Not an extensive kind of things. Talk to me about that and your thoughts on that.
My biggest fear is that we can look a couple states over at Arizona and look what's going on. They did this a couple years ago, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars shortfall because of what that did to their program. Okay, they'll point to states, and I know Representative Harrison points to different states that have done well. But I think if you pilot it, it's got to be on a needs basis. It cannot be incomes in the 6 figures that can afford to go anyway. They've got to have the public strings attached. Stevie, you sent me a link to a 60-page document of mandates from the state, right? I've looked through all of them over the last week. It is unreal, the stuff that the state comes up with that aren't teachers, by the way, or educators or former administrators that have an idea what goes on inside the walls of a public school. But these are things that the state pushes and says, figure it out, right? Whether that's partially funded, totally unfunded, and some of them may be fully funded, but it ain't a whole lot of them. I can promise you that. Mm-hmm. And one of them, the most recent one, was security. The security after Uvalde, there was a big push to say, hey, we're putting security on schools, right? You know what they gave schools, each campus? $15,000. That doesn't pay for half of the salary of the security guard that has to go, let alone the training, TCOL certificate, firearm, uniform, all the above, right? And so that is the definition of something that is a priority for families in the state of Texas, that the state said, okay, we'll do it, but you figure it out from here, right? That is a partially funded mandate that, and we saw a screen at the county commissioners meeting a couple weeks ago, that's $4 or $5 million just in Ellis County of unfunded mandates. that they have to treat and care for prisoners and provide for healthcare services for prisoners. These unfunded mandates may be the thing that absolutely is crushing these local government entities more than anything.
I was reviewing that, and I'm going to have Mr. Belding on, and then from MISD, and I've had Mr. Hollingsworth on, Superintendent WISD, and he talked about how unfunded mandates are affecting these different schools, and it is tremendous. Now, some of those things I saw on the list, they're things that schools should be doing, but there are some that are coming from the state that are like, for instance, that security thing. You got to have a cop in every single campus. That's fine, but that costs a lot of money.
It costs more than $15,000.
And that partnership between what's the saving grace in Ellis County is that our districts and our local police departments have such great relationships, our cities.
The SRO program started when I was on the board, and we had one, maybe two at that time at the high school campus. That has been the best partnership that we could have ever done. And you'll start to see a lot of other school districts do it, because then the school doesn't have to take on the full cost. They split it with the city of training, providing the car, the vehicle, and also the equipment for those security guards or those SROs to be on campus.
So you talked about, and you mentioned this briefly, you talked about billionaires in West Texas and that kind of stuff. Just break that down a little bit for the viewers.
So where this started, and I'll be a little bit cartoonistic here, but this is how I envision it. I envision these West Texas oil guys, and I'm not against people making billions. All right, this is capitalism. You want to work hard and make $1 billion, go for it. But what I envision them doing is sitting around a campfire on a high fence game ranch, getting ready to have their guides and scouts go out and tell them what animal to shoot. And they're like, hey, we just made $2 billion last month. What do you want to do with it? Let's take down public school. And here's why. It's because Tim Dunn, who's the primary guy in the state of Texas, he owns Midland Classical Academy. It's a private school in Midland. It's his property that he owns, his residence butts up right to where his school is. He pays Midland school property taxes on $5 million worth of property. And so he was probably a little ticked that he spent money to build a private school and he's still having to pay public school taxes. And DV, this goes back when I was a kid, like the teacher was right 100% of the time. If I said something and I tried to beef what the teacher said, Mama said, no, sir. Miss Anderson is right every time. And you go back and apologize.
Yeah.
That culture of student-teacher, it's gone. I know there's some good, and we struggle with our own kids. I'm self-admitted. Like, it is hard to parent kids right now. And so what I sent an email to our teachers right after the first day of school, and I said, you are right. My student is wrong. If you say he's wrong, you let me know if he acts up. Okay. I've gotten an email already. First month of school, my junior hire, trying to figure it out. He's trying to find his way. I get it. Okay. But this has been a slow villainization. Is that a right word? Like making public school the villain, right? And what's the best way to make somebody the villain or to create this culture of fear or fear mongering? It's to hit them in their pocketbook, right? Property taxes in the last 10 years, 15 years, especially the last 5 or 10 in Ellis County, have gotten really high, right? Values have gotten out of control. I'm in the mortgage business. I see sales prices and contracts every day. That's what they've done. And so if you're the billionaire in West Texas, what do you start doing? You start casting doubt on public schools. When did we start hearing about book banning, critical race theory, all these things? I was behind the dais at the school board listening to people talk to me about things that simply weren't happening in our school district, okay? But it started to gain traction. The number one thing that happened, we saw it in 2017, started to see it in 2014, but in 2019 with House Bill 3, they required you to put language that said this is a tax increase. Even if your school district was keeping their rate flat, right? They're saying it's a tax increase. And we can argue A and B. I've argued it for 5 years on what's right. How do you explain it to taxpayers? Those kind of things. We spent most of those bond campaigns explaining that one phrase rather than here's how we're going to serve 11,000 students. We explained this one phrase for 4 months to try to get that thing passed. That thing, when the money that Tim Dunn and the Wilkes brothers and all these folks have given to these PACs, there's school board members, DV, that are receiving $10,000 to $50,000 from PACs to run for school board campaigns. I think I spent $5,000 and I ran one of the most I had signs on it, Marvin, Maine, all the way up and down 77. Okay, $5,000. You have school board members that are getting paid $10,000 to $50,000 from these PACs to get on. All you need is 4. 4 out of 7 gets the vote, right, on a school board. It can drastically change the culture in an independent school district when that happens. I think that's where it started. That is a personal belief. There's plenty of articles out there that can help explain that. But I think there's a lot of people with a lot of money that don't think public schools are the right fit, and they're trying to do it in Austin.
And it's a heated debate. Like I posted an article that came out in our local news somewhere that talked about teachers, the teacher pay and the teacher exodus. I just posted that recently, and the comments are a mess. The comments are a mess because the comments are a mess because people have so many strong opinions about this. And
think about the salary we pay our teachers. Whether it's when I was on the school board, I think it was $45,000 for a starting teacher, maybe 44. I think now it's closer to 54, and that's been over. So they've gotten $10,000 in the 10 years that I've been in this realm. And when you think about the roles that we ask teachers to do, I think about the guy pushing a rock uphill. Every year that rock gets bigger, and that's state of Texas unfunded mandates, right? They keep asking teachers to do more with less. Now you're at that point, and I think legislative session 2025 is the tipping point. Because they've bought enough seats around the state of Texas through representative races that it's going to be really close on this vote. Okay. It's going to be a heated debate. There'll be protests at the Capitol. It will be heated. It's a passionate issue for a lot of people. And these teachers are at that point where they're holding that rock as hard and as fast. They've got 22 kids that now they have to spend 2 to 3, 4 or 5 weeks just planning for what they're going to do because of all the stuff that's going to happen. And A through F really put the pressure on them to do that, right? If you get voted a C, D, F school, that means your realtors are no longer telling people to move to your community. So A through F kind of had a bigger economic effect than just public education. It had a massive effect on the economies of these local towns and cities. And so when you think about the pressure that a teacher has to take, our teachers are sometimes parents to these kids. They take them to places, they bring them lunch. They're nurses, they're coaches, they're counselors, they're mental health specialists. They only get paid for one of those, right? That's why I put this shirt up behind me, and I'm sorry to do that. But teaching, we like to say it's a calling, right? We like to say, hey, they're called to do that. That's no longer fair, right? Because we've leaned on that $10,000 over 10 years. That's not right, okay? No other profession in the world gets that kind of treatment with added responsibility, okay? And so it's no longer just a calling. A lot of them are called to do it, and I'm thankful that they're there in the classroom, but it's no longer just a calling. It's time to treat them as professionals, pay them as such, and to expect reasonable expectations accordingly.
Because I hear this often, and I always wonder what this means, but when you hear the arguments against school choice, you hear we need to fully fund schools or fully fund this or that or the other. What is fully fund? What does that look like?
DV, to me, a perfect example is special education. There's so much, and I'm an inclusion fan, right? Like I love the idea. I think it's good for both sides, for regular population or education population to be able to mix and to be able to interact with those folks. It's healthy for both sides, right? And so I think that's a great thing. The problem is, look what happened in Corsicana the first week of school. Assistant principal had to go into a classroom, Kendra Rogers, who was in Waxahachie ISD last year as an assistant principal at the high school, and gets hit with a chair. Because they don't have the people to take care of special populations, right? And I'm not blaming it on special ed. It's the same thing. My kid could have done something like that, right? You have one person in a classroom with 22 humans. And a lot of those humans we're talking about, I'm looking at these stats of special education, dyslexia, all the needs that our students have right now, we can't meet them. So when I say fully fund, it means pay our teachers a livable wage, a competitive wage that's a profession that honors the certificate. I know Mr. Harrison said their certificate's not worth the paper it's printed on, but it is. Those teachers went to school to be, or they took a class or emergency certification to be a teacher. They want to be in those classrooms because they love kids, right? So give them the support that they deserve to do that. I think that's fully funding. A lot of times when people say they're over, I've seen it on Twitter ever since that show, DV, you've had my blood pressure going.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's all information. That's why I've got a whiteboard full of stats over here. So he said $500 million stadium, right? Like those are the key words. There's no $500 million stadium in a high school in the country. AT&T stadium, maybe. I think he meant bond package. There's some $50 million stadiums in the country. You know what happens in those? The local people voted on them. So whether you like it or not, that is the most pure election when a local taxpayer can say yes or no to a bond measure, right? They usually have 6 to 12 months to get informed. You present as these school districts spend months of pouring out information about what they're doing with these bond funds, right? And you still see these passing 5149, 5248, right? And it's because of taxes. Do I think property taxes need to go down? I do. I wish. I hope. I'm looking at my property tax bill right here, $8,416 with 6,000 going to the ISD, right? But, and here's where, and DV, this may be a little bit progressive of me, and I apologize, and I'm sure I'll get screenshotted and blasted on Twitter for this. But I'm going to tell you how I feel and what I think. That's who I am. If you want to be gotcha, not that you are, but if somebody wants to be gotcha, then get me, okay? But what I think is, how do you, like, what's the solution, right? If property taxes is really what's caused this animosity to the public school system because it's the largest item on your tax bill, then what do you do about it? Ryan wants to eliminate it, right? I'm all for it. But where does the money come to pay for the public schools, right? Until you can give me that option, where does it come? He says you cut administrative bloat, right? You know what percent of a district salary administrative bloat is? About 3.5. Okay. You could spread all that over teacher salary and you might be able to get them one extra lunch per month on their salary, 10 or 11 bucks. Okay. The other bloat that you always see is athletics, even less, 3% of the budget. Okay. Those are not big items. The lion's share of a school district's budget happens inside the classroom. Okay. It's those salaries, it's the supplies, it's the materials to educate our kids. So when you talk about fully fund, I think it's give our teachers a chance to educate them. Take away the pressure. I agree with you. There should be some sort of assessment. You have to know if you're going to take public dollars, you better be able to show that here's what I'm doing with them. Okay. I think STAR is a great assessment. I think the weight and the pressure of it has gone way too far. Can't remember the numbers on how much we spend on it. 300 million, and maybe even more that we spend on STAR just alone, right? These kids, these school districts, these realtors that sell their communities, they're basing it on one day. They're not basing a school district on the fine arts that they provide, the athletic experience they provide, the well-roundedness that they provide, the ability for special education students to have their needs met, right? They don't grade the school as a well-rounded. If they did, I think you would see a drastically different experience between the public and public schools.
If they looked at it more, yeah.
Wholeheartedly. I mean, DV, these kids, I know our generation has, every generation says the generation behind them is the worst thing that ever happened, right? They're addicted to their tablets. All they do is text and they don't know how to write checks and all. I hear it all the time, right? These kids are some of the well-rounded. We have kids graduating with welding degrees, going to make $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 as entrepreneurs in their own welding business. And they get that certificate during high school, right? You can name that for almost any trade position that's out there right now. They can do that. And I think you'll see a huge shift from four-year education or post high school education to trades. I think the average tradesperson is 57 years old right now. So in 5 or 6 years, you're going to see a huge glut in that profession, in those professions. And our high schools are already doing what they need to do to prepare the kids to take over those spots.
If you are a boiler tradesman, if you're a boilerman, you're average in the 60s, 60 years old. I'm an HVAC guy, where the average is 45. Yeah, there is the graying of the trade, as we call it. I harp on that stuff because I think that look, if your kid is good at schooling, then by all means send them to college. That might be their thing. But other kids, that might not be there. And that's where it goes back to our other conversation about not one size fits all.
It's not. And I think, and I'm super biased towards Waxahachie because that's my world, right? That's where I'm a school board member. That's where I've substituted. I've been on it. I'm the PTO president right now at Wildman. That's what I know. And so when you think about the whole kid and all these experiences, that's what we're doing. We talk about school choice. Waxahachie gives you the idea to go to 2 dual language campuses. They give you the idea to go to a STEAM campus, a biomedical campus, a early high school STEM high school, all within the same school district. Why can't that be the model, right? Let's make what we have better and fully fund it and give them these choices without having to send them somewhere else. We can do it if we want to. If you want to jump out of the bottom 10 in national funding per state, when you go state by state, in which Texas should never be in the bottom 10 of anything, right? That's embarrassing. If you want to jump out of that, you will see a difference within a year or two, immediate difference. If you want to fully fund public education they're already doing it, DV. It's just not the stories that's getting told on Twitter and Facebook.
Unfortunately, I got to wrap up because we've gone longer than I normally go. No, that's fine because I love this. I love that this conversation has to be having in a respectful way. And I love that you were able to come on and give that side of that school choice debate or vouchers.
You call it whatever you want.
So,
It's public money going to a private entity. That period.
So on my show, my guest always gets the last word. But before I give you that last word, I was going to ask you, there's been grumblings of Matt running for HD10. What does that look like? Are you going to break news on the Ellis Talker Show?
No, I won't be breaking any news. DV, I kicked myself. My family needed me a lot a year ago when I was going to run. I kicked myself for him going unopposed. And I think that position should always have to defend their spot, right? I've told you that I don't think he's had any town halls. I think he views his town halls as the GOP meeting, but there's been no town halls. He's met with no public school board since he's been elected, which I think is a shame. And so my frustration, I will guarantee that I will break this news. I will guarantee this. He will not go unopposed next time if he decides to run. Okay. There's too many people that think that our teachers, number one, in Ellis County. A lot of people think that he's representing, like even on your show, he talked about a student in Austin ISD. That's not, when Brian Harrison was elected and his name was on the ballot, it said State Representative HD10, which is my district. And so I want him to represent my students, my kids, my interests, not national interest or these kind of Twitter explosions that he puts on there where if you're a public school supporter, that you're all of a sudden now big government liberal, right? I voted Republican since I was 18 years old, right? My first election was Bush, and I wore a Aggies for Bush shirt, and they made me take it off because you can't wear a candidate. I was 18, I didn't know the rules. You can't wear a candidate shirt in line at the polls, right? And so I've always voted Republican. But what I think is that House District 10 needs is somebody that wants to represent the needs of me and you and people that live in this community. I don't think that's being done now. I guarantee you he will not get to skate into office next time. He will have an opponent. If it's me, I'm committed to my family right now. Like my boys are 12, 10, and 8. And that's why I say, as much as I disagree with Mr. Harrison, he is sacrificing a lot of time away from his family, okay, to do what he thinks is right. Okay. And I honor that. I did that as a school board member. He's doing it times 10 as a member of the state House of Representatives. Yes. And so I respect that and I honor it. I don't know if I'm ready to make that commitment away from my children yet. My wife works her tail off as a principal. That's why I see the behind the scenes of these people do not work 8 to 5. My wife's lucky if she goes to bed at 10:30 or 11 without responding to emails and texts. And then she wakes up at 5 to see who's needs a substitute for the next day. So it is a nonstop job. So no guarantees other than there will be a contested House District 10 election next time.
I always ask the break news on the Ellis Talker Show because I always wanted. So yeah, last word for you.
Mine is just please get educated. And DV, I can't truly, and I'm not just trying to patronize you here, but just people get educated. When you see these stats that public schools are putting books out there that kids shouldn't be reading, that they're teaching your kids things that they have no business read, just understand it. These teachers are doing the absolute best that they can. And we'll talk about school choice. One of the things, if you could plot line a student's success over their K through 12 experience, it is directly correspondent to the amount of time that their parents put into it. And I know a lot of our families have a lot of challenges and struggles that they deal with, but if you will invest in your child's education, it will make it better for you. It'll make it better for your student, and it will 1000% make it better for our great teachers.
Matt, I do appreciate you coming on the show. It's been good getting to know you a little bit. Hopefully we could do some breakfast one of these days.
Absolutely.
And we could talk ESA/vouchers and
/vouchers. That's right.
/vouchers. So thanks again for coming on the show. Can you stick around real quick after?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.